if there's a sort of caricature or let's say like a prototype debate that really tears people apart across generations, between friends, between coworkers, whatever it might be, I think this is that conversation fundamentally.
We're going to talk about politics once again, and specifically two of the buzzwords that come up in every election: capitalism versus socialism. And just a little of the history here. I feel as if almost every election in recent times comes back to the economy. What's the position on the economy? What's the philosophy? And that really does drive so many voters. It just comes down to how they think their personal economic situation is going to fare based on an administration. And there's a constant critique of every administration throughout its lifespan over the state of the economy. And I would say maybe it's not an exaggeration to think that most pundits will predict however the economy looks now is going to determine the state of the next national election. And the main challenge, I think, with economic systems is the complexity. They're tremendously complex. And just the capitalism versus socialism binary, as if it has to be one or the other, is a false dichotomy in a lot of ways, because in the human repertoire of experience, we have both possibilities and we have mixtures. Most countries do have some mixture of capitalism and socialism. We think of fire departments and police departments, and you sort of a blend of what works well under a socialist kind of framework, and then what works well, what is capitalism good for, is maybe another way to think about this. So in this discussion, we'll try to get some thoughts out there on the capitalism versus socialism, capitalism and socialism, as well as the role of the economy in voting and how we can think about it as citizens.
No, I'm really happy we've finally gotten to this topic. In a way, I feel like it's sort of a culmination of what we've been building up to, assembling all the pieces that need to be in place, having a general idea of how we become attached to our points of view, different tactics for engaging in political dialogue that can easily run astray of being productive. But I would say it's fair to say that this discussion, capitalism and socialism, the battle for dominance between these two views, is the flashpoint of our culture at this moment. And I would say no one's really figured out how to have the conversation yet, because it winds up being this canard where one feels, as you said, one view represents not just a practical way of solving problems, right? It's not like you're at Home Depot or a store looking for tools to solve problems. It is a system of belief and morals and ethics. And that's what seems to be what's at stake here, is if somebody says, oh, I am a capitalist or I am a socialist, that winds up complecting the way we see them as a person, like the whatever moral virtues that we think they subscribe to. And depending on whether or not your views are congenial to theirs, you might wind up making all sorts of judgments about their character, their intelligence, things of that nature. And so I think a good place to start is being cognitive neuroscientists to understand what really is the bedrock on which these systems are founded, right? So since the capitalist system is really the hegemonic system, it's what we have in place now. We were having a sidebar conversation before we got rolling with the camera here about some of the brain basis for capitalism, how it could even emerge in the first place.
That's right, and capitalism has this bad rap of being about greed. It's about some people are being successful and unfairly taking more than their share, the 1%. And there seems to be this story of great inequity. And from the brain basis, you can start to think about, well, money is a stand-in for business transaction, and it's about trust. Without trust, you do not have a successful currency. And currencies have failed on the basis of lack of trust in that governing group issuing the currency. So in many ways, I think one of the most brilliant commentaries comes from Yuval Harari in the book Sapiens, which was wildly popular about the sort of unseen aspects of human history and the human story. And there's a brilliant chapter called The Capitalist Creed in that book, in which Harari takes it back to trust. Really, one of his claims is that one of the major adaptations that enabled Homo sapiens to become so successful as a species and proliferate the world with such great control is the fact that we can trust one another and therefore work in coordinated groups. And this isn't really visible in other large-brained species. They're very social. Elephants, chimpanzees, whales, they certainly are social animals. But we have this unique capacity, seemingly, to delay gratification and project out into the future. And as long as we can build rapport and trust, we can do amazing things together. Capitalism is about collaboration. And as one generates, sort of these trust-building relationships, amazing things can happen. And it all is relevant to currency. So in the old days, you'd have to, let's imagine you're a farmer selling grain. You've got to find a buyer for grain who has something you want, and the only means of exchange was to exchange your grain for something else. Well, if no one wants the grain, you're totally out of luck, except for the fact that we can plan for the future. We know when there's a shortage, and we have money to stand in for the grain. So we have a medium of exchange with the promise of paying something back in the future where everyone wins. The whole community can win. And that really is the basis for capitalism, according to Harari. And I just thought it was an amazing description. It's not cutting the pie up where some people have massive sections of the pie and it's taking away from other people. His claim is really that capitalism is growing the pie bigger, right? Because when someone is a successful entrepreneur who builds a company, they're putting a product out into the world. It's a consumer good, and they're employing a whole lot of people, and there's so much more capital and so much more infused into the system, so many people can win. And I think that's such a refreshing take on capitalism, which tends toward greed. And so the basis for trust is, of course, our tribal hunter-gatherer past, oxytocin levels, bonding with other people socially.
No, I think that's a great summation of why capitalism emerged in a naturalistic story of why it's been so enormously successful across the world. I think it's fair to say that reputational tracking is really the important leverage point for having a capitalist system that functions well. A sense that one's reputation, where one has amassed wealth, has become successful by the conventional standards within a system like that, is well earned, it's well deserved. In fact, the way in which we're able to tolerate differentials in wealth is to say, well, this person worked harder, right? They saved, they made wise choices, they were prudent, and that's why this person's living in a city unto itself, in a mansion, and why others aren't. And I think for as long as that sort of narrative has trust and credence behind it, it's easier for the system to remain stable. But I don't know if you would agree with this, but it seems to me that there has been some fracturing in the integrity of reputations, where we assume that somebody who has amassed wealth in the system, whether they really, really deserve it, or if they have too much wealth, whether it could be shared with more, whether people deserve at least an opportunity to get started. Like to say, well, if this person had the same inheritance, the same starting point, the same starting deck, they would have a similar stupendous amount of wealth, right? The kind of the arbitrary, fickle nature in how people can be lucky or not lucky, and that can be the deciding factor in whether it's successful or not. It's more and more difficult, I think, for people to feel comfortable with these outcomes over the long term if they have a difficult time seeing like a meritocratic earned element to that wealth. And I think that was kind of the starting point, the starting fracture in the armor of the capitalist ideology that has made room for this sort of counterforce, this counterbalance of the socialist point of view. Do you kind of see it that way as well?
Well, I think another element comes into this. So wealth disparity is a major problem.
Yeah.
And if we're in a tribal sort of existence, it starts to become a problem because people are comparing one another, and their circumstances are not equal or even resembling equality. And I think when capitalism a free market goes unchecked and unregulated for long enough, you begin to have basically monopolies, right? You tend toward monopolies, which crowd out the competition. It's like somebody at a poker table who basically has so many more chips that you can't play against them anymore because they don't even have to have the cards. They just can simply outbet you, and there's nothing you can do about it. That is a problem within a capitalist system. It's why you do need regulation. Not to say you want to regulate it too much. It's a balancing act, right? You've got to balance control and regulation with free market dynamics. And so that's another flashpoint politically, is people want to be either free market or in favor of regulation, and our parties do own those positions in essence. But it's much more complex than I think most people realize, because you do not want to kill the momentum. To keep capitalist free markets growing, you have to relax regulations and print more money. That's what enables it to grow. But if you do that in a totally unchecked way, the wealth disparities and the tendency toward monopolies becomes a problem. And I think on a daily basis, for just the American citizen on the street, the wealth disparity problem has become very large. And so wealth is relative, and we compare our circumstances to those around us all the time. So tensions grow.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, really going back to our wheelhouse here as cognitive neuroscientists, think about the way the brain functions. It might seem almost like a very mealy-mouthed, middle ground, moderate point of view in almost the pejorative sense when we say, oh, well, the answer is both and, it's not either or, right? But it really is the case. If you think about natural systems that are well organized and function very well, like the brain, for instance, we have circuits that actually work at cross purposes with one another in a harmonious way, right? Opponent processing is one of the reasons why we have fine-tuned motor movement. The fact that we have excitatory glutamatergic circuits, and then we have GABA-mediated inhibitory circuits. The fact that they have to work together, an accelerator and the brakes. And I think when it comes to these conversations, if there's a sort of broader view of, it's not just the conversation of socialism and capitalism, but a sort of meta conversation, like, well, this is what has to happen. This is natural. It's inevitable. It's inevitable that you're going to have, yes, advocates for one's own ambition. When you think about entrepreneurship, the fact that every person in this world wants to have a chance of success, to be able to live their life, right? But then we also have this concern, like you said, if there's somebody at the poker table who has become so successful that all they have to do is just start the pool, and they've already won, no one else has an opportunity, then there has to be this sort of counterbalance to say, well, how are we going to ensure that the game keeps going? Because the game already appears over to some generations, successive generations, as soon as they look at the world around them and say, well, here I am, a young person just starting my life. How am I even be able to afford a home for my family with interest rates the way they are? The fact that you have all these properties being brought up and converted into big rental units, it's very dystopian, I think, to many young people, and it makes it difficult for them to feel the same level of pride, I think, that maybe previous generations had, say, since the 50s and 60s, when this was considered like the golden age of economic expansion. But I think,
yeah, but I don't think people living in that time period thought it was the golden. You don't ever know
exactly
it's the golden age when you're living in it, because there's always something to complain about.
Sure.
There's always a wealthier neighbor.
That's right.
Or there's always somebody that seems to be undeservedly getting an unfair share. And I think to the point you'd made earlier about the counterbalance within a system, the problem with the human brain is we never root for the system. Like, no one's super happy if the system seems to be doing well, but their own personal circumstances are not very good, especially if others nearby are doing better than them. It's all comparative.
Yes.
And we think in narratives. We think in individual narratives. And it's why that's so powerful on a campaign trail. It's like this kind of talk of regulation, not regulation. You lose people because they don't understand it. And there's a good reason we don't understand it. We're not meant to track money and exchange and corporate dynamics at this complexity level they're at. So we should expect in some ways that it's not going to resonate with people to say you need a balance. Ultimately, we are individuals and we think in narratives, and we are at the level of our brains. It's very disturbing to us when we see people who are very, very successful and don't seem to have earned it. Now, by contrast, everybody loves the Horatio Alger story, right? The person who's born with nothing and goes through and manages to become wealthy. Everyone roots for that story. It's like the hero's journey.
Yes.
And there's something there as well about we want to see the struggle. Like, we root for overcoming the struggle.
Yes.
And I think that's a very powerful narrative in which, capitalism is a good thing when it's the person that creates the company that gives a lot of wealth and jobs to their fellow human beings. And there's just, it's so complicated within our minds trying to understand the economy through those individuals, like an avatar for a whole system. And we want to find the greedy capitalist, the Gordon Gekko character, to label as the greedy capitalist. In reality, there are benevolent capitalists and there's greedy socialists. And so keeping that complexity in mind, always looking for another example, is an important thing to just try to understand our economic circumstances.
You also just pointed out why it's important, and this is something we emphasize in some of our first episodes, the value circumplex by Shalom Schwartz. You're already bringing that in. Just naturally, we think about how our values come to the foreground when we think about these stories, these narratives that we form within the context of different economic systems. Like you mentioned, the hero's journey, right? The modern day entrepreneur, the scrappy individual who just has nothing but a knapsack and a dream and manages to build an empire. That in itself is a story of overcoming great difficulties, and it's heroic. It makes our hearts swell with pride to think about that and wanting to walk in those footsteps. But what's interesting is I've also listened to people who are like real veteran, battle-hardened, revolutionary types, and the fact that they really pride themselves on their identity as socialists, and they have the same story in their head, right? The scrappy individual warring against an empire, right? In this case, these power wielders, these sort of nameless, faceless corporations. They don't see the human stories within them at all, right? And that's what we need. Like if you're an ideologue, if you're a zealot for your ideology, you have to evacuate the other side, as it were, of all of its humanity. I'm convinced of this. The extent to which you don't see human beings anymore, you just see this sort of nefarious, malevolent force that you're warring against. That's how you're able to engage in really hyperbolic action of the sort to where you are merciless, right? If you look at revolutions throughout history, you think, well, how can human beings treat each other that way? Well, it's a trick question because they don't see the people they're hurting as humans at all. Right? That's, I think, where the danger comes in, because every person with their ideology sees that hero's journey within the group that they support, right? They don't think of themselves as being on the wrong side of history. I think that's one of the curiosities that we see in these struggles that stretch back centuries, right?
That may be. And so one of the things that I think is really helpful for thinking about the economy is just to follow some stocks. If you're a market participant, you have a different glimpse of the economy. There are winners and losers, and there are good quarters and bad quarters, and it's extremely hard to predict this, right? It's like there's no situation in which you rely on the government for everything to work, right? The government is like a setting. The philosophy, if it's Republican-led or Democrat-led, it's going to set a context, but within that context, you have winners and losers, and those are basically those human stories of how well is someone meeting market demand and timing, and those are really the key elements. I think when I consider the economy, I never think, well, there's a good economy or a bad economy. It's a complicated economy all the time, and what's right for the moment is what we need to root for in terms of our politicians. They're merely setting the stage, which has an influence. It's just that the players on that stage are the people running the companies, the people involved in all those, everyday Americans who are doing their daily work are the players in the actual drama. And the reason it's so difficult to make money reliably, even for people that do finance as their career, is that it's so complex, and you can get the timing wrong. So you can be right about the future of a company, but if you time it wrong, you lose money on it. And I think there's some powerful lessons there just in those micro examples. And if you're not a stock market participant, maybe just tracking some companies' prices and the basis for it. If more Americans did that, I think we would appreciate what capitalism really is. There's a lot of free market forces And it is not a full meritocracy, because there's definitely going to be, reading the tea leaves and surfing the wave, whatever the analogy would be. You can time something right and not have done much work, and you do well. But most of the time, for most people, it's paying attention and putting in the hard work. It's the same story of human perseverance, whether it's on the sort of high finance side, or just basically managing your household economics. It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah, I think one of the changes that needs to occur is how we think about participation in the economy itself as having changed so dramatically over the generations. I remember when I was younger, the whole model of what adult life was supposed to look like was a very clearly delineated, structured system. Very simplified. Simple. You finish up your primary schooling, you go to college, get a college degree, get a job, eventually get your retirement. Right? It's all laid out in a very simple way. And when we play that story out in our minds, we don't do so thinking, I'm barely going to survive through this. Right? The idea is that you're still going to flourish. You're still going to enjoy your life while doing this. But very few people can follow that model and find that they are entirely satisfied with the quality of their life when they're doing this. But one thing I've tried to embrace in my own life, what I realize is that you have to embrace having a sort of diversified opportunity portfolio in your life, right? If you just have this very monochromatic life, like all I'm doing is I'm just doing this one thing, this one job, whatever it is, it's difficult, right? But if you have diversified your skill sets, if you're embracing that there are multiple challenges that you can engage in simultaneously, because we can be in more than one place at once. Like here, physically we're here talking to each other, but on our phones, we're virtually in other places. If you have your money working for you through stocks, as you mentioned, if you're building a podcast, as you and I are doing, we also have jobs besides this, right? And we found a way to sort of interleave multiple layers to our lives and our identities. And that creates more of like a richness of experience that through the outside, if you describe a life like that, what I realize is it sounds overwhelming. It's like, how do you keep track of all this? But I think we're actually built for that. I think we're actually built for having the multifaceted, well-rounded nature. And it is possible to live exactly that way in this economy. That you definitely need to have some fortune. You have to meet the right people. You have to have the social connections. But if you are willing to take chances, if you're willing to fail many, many, many times, and not see those as failures, but see those as just part of your journey, part of building that repertoire.
Learning opportunities.
Exactly. That mindset can really take you much further than in an economy where these opportunities are stifled in some other than the crib, so to speak, right? That is one of the advantages of living in a society like this.
This is why immigration is a constant echo on campaign trails as well. Many, many people want to come here to participate in this economy. And I try to remind myself of that at our darkest moments as a nation. There's so many people that want in. They want these opportunities. And I like what you said about diversification. So if there's any, very basic fact you've got to learn about the stock market is if you're into tech stocks, put some of your money outside of tech stocks. You need to diversify your portfolio, right? Because if tech stocks all rise, you're happy. If tech stocks all fall, you've got no insulation.
Going down with the ship.
So you stick your money in a diversity of stocks so that when one industry has a downturn, when one economic lever is pulled, maybe it's even by the government, your entire wealth doesn't crash. Rather, you've got it parked in multiple spots so that there's protection against a big failure. And that is why any portfolio manager will diversify the portfolio. That's one of your basics. And I think I've heard humans as described as infovores. Have herbivores, carnivores, or information seekers.
Yes.
And in many ways, that's an important element to how we live our lives as well. We're never done learning, and we want more information. And so if you're feeling down, and you're thinking just under this administration, I can't possibly succeed. I need for my party to get back in power. Why not try diversifying a little bit more and focusing more on what opportunities are out there? And very quickly you get in a totally different conversation of it's complicated, and a lot of things are not government controlled. We don't live in a dictatorship, and that's a good thing. And seek more information, look for more opportunities. And then I think you get that benefit of seeing the opportunities, maybe making some gains, and you just have a more positive outlook of those circumstances.
No, I think that's really well put. And, I really do think that with the technological advancements that we've seen in the last couple of decades, I think many of us are still in this sort of surreal experience where we're still trying to acclimate. Even myself, I mean, I'm not exactly an old person, but all the same, it's really staggering to me because when I went to school, we didn't have smartphones, right? And the fact that we have access to almost anything you ever want to learn about all the time, it's really overwhelming. And it can lead to a sort of paralysis. In fact, it's even difficult to keep track of goals long term because you have so many goals, so many things you can start, and it's very difficult. And really, an economy, I think the great hazard, if there's one hazard that's ubiquitous, it's distraction. That is the great peril of life today. And being able to accrue on a sort of slow and steady basis that incremental advancement towards one's goals takes these long-term, very, very patient, almost continental drift pace, inch by inch, making gains towards whatever the things are that you care about in your life. And I think it's all too easy to judge if one's life is not going particularly well, to look for the outside circumstances that explain this. But I think once we turn the view inward and say, well, what can I do in these circumstances? The things I can't control, right, as much as I wish I could. But let me focus on the local. In fact, this is where our brains really excel. If we as cognitive neuroscience can say this, we're not built for having this sort of universal view of the world. In fact, I heard this great quote. I think you'll like this. A poet wants to dip their head into heaven, and a scientist wants to cram heaven into their head. That's one of the great tragedies of being a scientist. And I think we can relate to this. You want so badly to understand, see it all, understand it all. But the more we run our head up against the problem, realize you can't possibly comprehend everything. We're not built for this universal store of knowledge model of the world, but our local circumstances, yes, that's where the brain really excels. It's one of the reasons why we can have these very skewed pictures of how well the world is doing. So oftentimes we just look at our neighbors and we can get a sense of how well people are doing in general, but that's just a very small, tiny island in this vast world that we inhabit. So if we turn our view into the local, think about relationships we have that could become businesses, perhaps. If you're able to share your talents together in synergistic ways, that's how businesses are started. It's how goals are established. You're able to go very far when you have a sort of extended family of different skill sets kind of gelling together. I mean, that's I think the story even of our friendship and the opportunities we've been able to pursue. And I realized there were times in life where I remember what that was like, where I was like, where do I go from here? There's too many paths to follow, and it was much easier to just imagine if the world could just change itself. So that the red carpet towards success could just present itself to me.
Yeah, and we generalize. We're immersed in our local circumstances all the time, and we're seeking rewards and avoiding punishments. And our own local circumstances tend to drive our political preferences. And so, if you are personally doing quite well, things seem a lot rosier, and you want the status quo to continue. But if for some reason things are not going that well in your life, let's just say financially, just because we're on sort of the economy topic, you do want to see change. And I think one of the challenges we face with sort of the red-blue divide of the US is that people want to make it I will succeed, my whole set of circumstances is tied to this party, and this party being in power. And if this party's not in power, whichever party it is, everything's going to go to hell. And that seems to be this perception. And I think one of the challenges with the economy driving our elections is that we're not just an economy, right? There's so much more to the United States. We need to think about our national defense. We need to think about aspects of immigration and growth in our nation and healthcare. And those seem to be a backdrop. And it's almost like we focus on the economy and our local circumstances too much. And so I think that's another thing we can try to do as citizens to be productive, is to just hold in check this idea that the government determines our economic circumstances at every turn. It really doesn't track that way if you're willing to look more broadly, and also remember that we've got a country to run here, and it's complicated. It's not simply that the economy, good economy means everything's great, bad economy, the reverse. We may feel localized pain depending on those circumstances, but there's a bigger system to think about. And that's the burden we have as voters, to try to think at that big system level, transcend our local circumstances and make the right decision for the most people most of the time.
Yeah, I think when it comes to like the practical advice, the technical advice for dialogue between those who subscribe to different ideologies, the analogy it pops into my head is it's like a conversation between people who enjoy different genres of movies or music. And that's basically what we're talking about here, different tastes in heroes' narratives, different distribution of values that we subscribe to. And a very boring conversation is if, let's say, I love dramas and you love action movies, and we're just having a battle for which genre is better. It's a silly conversation. It's a waste of time, right? It's a matter of tastes. And instead, well, what is it you see about these films that you enjoy so much, right? Try to see the world through your eyes and imagine what would it be like to be able to detect certain things that really are kind of invisible to me, right? It's like a different spectrum of the human experience you're sensitive to. And that's what I've noticed. In really productive conversations with those who are more socialist in orientation, they're sensitive to certain kinds of heroes' stories and narratives and plights and difficulties that human beings can go through that I might not be as sensitive to off the bat. And you're opening the aperture, being infowars that we are. Embrace that identity as a human being and kind of open the scope. Have that growth mindset, as opposed to just having that battle over which genre is better, capitalism or socialism. Well, they both have their values, right? They both have something to contribute. And it's a matter of what's the right balance. But no one human being inside the confines of what they have between their ears is going to be able to know that answer, right? It's something that really kind of bubbles up as a sort of emergent property of many people having productive conversations within that space.
Yeah, I think business leaders that are really successful negotiate well. They try to have a win-win. Maybe one party gets a little bit more of the lion's share, but you don't fleece the other party, because that destroys trust, and that will be the last deal you ever make, and it will probably destroy your reputation as well. So I think that's another caricature that's a problem. The capitalist, greedy person that's like the corporate raider out to destroy the competition, that's some kind of idealized vision, and that's not really reality. To be successful on a regular basis and have a lot of wins, you have to contribute to the business community productively. And I think the real winners are not just financially doing well, they're actually really building that pie larger and allowing others to succeed. And so it all goes back to trust. And I think that's the glue that binds a lot of this together, is if you're promoting trust and you're in the business of helping others, you're doing it correctly. And karma, in a sense, is real, because it's social karma with others. And so the more we participate in business transactions, the more we learn that, and you will be punished if you act badly on a repeated basis. You might get away with it, and you might even become fabulously wealthy the one time, but the reputational cost will haunt you the rest of your life.
I like that. It's a naturalistic take on karma. That's what you did there. That's
There's some invisible hand of karma.
Yes.
Out there.
Yes. Well, I think this was a productive conversation. I'm happy we were able to discuss this. And frankly, I think all the tools in preceding episodes leading up to this, we had to bring them all to bear for a problem like this, because I recognize that if there's a sort of caricature or let's say like a prototype debate that really tears people apart across generations, between friends, between coworkers, whatever it might be, I think this is that conversation fundamentally. It happens so often. It could be that one's belief system can be embodied in an individual, a presidential candidate, right? But ultimately it comes down to these judgments we make about which ideology we're subscribing to in this ideological crisis or conflict of our times. And so I'm glad we were able to discuss this, and perhaps at some point we'll even be able to bring more guests on board to shed more light on having discussions of this sort, where it's not just general, but very specific type of topic like this debate. And so for those listening, we always appreciate everyone's patronage and time. And if you feel so inclined, please subscribe to hear more exciting content from our channel, and feel free to leave a comment below so we can hear from you.
Please like the video and
Yes.
participate in your local economy, and keep an open mind.
Absolutely.